Okay, everyone, if I can reform our meeting, please. So, very conscious of time. We have a number of items still on our agenda. But first of all, I would like to pass on to, I think it's Angela and Jason to talk about the new RMA legislation. Thank you.
Just want to note as an opening piece, this is an update on the legislation that was requested. So we have been working across the organisation, and Jason is going to present today. I just would like to acknowledge Esther, who's also at the table. This is Esther's first time here, and so she has, in the background, been doing a bunch of work on this. So thank you, Esther, and I'll hand over to you, Jason.
Tēnā koutou katoa, thank you for making the time, and I realise that actually there isn't much of it, so I'll cut to the chase. And yes, thank you, Asta, for preparing this presentation. So what we're going to talk about today is the two new replacement acts for the Resource Management Act. So we'll keep it pretty high level. There'll be some key themes that you get out of this, I hope. One of the key themes is going to be don't hold your breath. It's going to be looking like this for that much longer, because the polls indicate that there may be a change of government, and the new government isn't exactly in love with the exact wording of what these two new replacement acts look like. However, with that in mind, we'll keep going through the presentation. So, we have two new replacement acts, a Natural and Built Environment Act and the Spatial Planning Act, which are in force now. They've been enacted. However, they have a very, very long transition phase to them. We'll talk a bit more about that later. There's still some uncertainties too about exactly how long that is, but we'll get to why that is later as well. They are new legislation, in particular the Spatial Planning Act, but the Natural and Built Environment Act does have a lot of carryover from the old Resource Management Act. One of the main things that carries over is how long it is, but we won't go into that today. Yeah, you'll see on this slide a mention of tranches, rolling it out at different times for different regions, and that's key. And there's uncertainty about that in the sense that those tranches have yet to be identified, yet to be prescribed by central government. That was something that was supposed to happen sometime after the enactment of the laws, but it hasn't happened yet. Okay, let's crack into it, Asta, thank you. So there's a bunch of detail here that I don't propose to spend much time on, in part because actually a lot of these changes that start immediately relate more to regional councils than they do to district councils and the functions that we have. But just, yeah, a couple of passing notes. That the maximum duration for new freshwater-related consents, you may instantly start thinking, what does that mean for our infrastructure arm? The answer to that is potentially not as much as you might think, because there are exceptions for public water supplies. And yeah, look, there's a long list of other changes there that do start immediately, but I think let's not overemphasise that, because actually mostly the RMA continues to live on pretty much as it is for many, many years to come. So I don't want to overemphasise these changes. I think really it's more important to get your head around the fact that the Resource Management Act will live on, and that transition phase is just pretty long. But we'll talk about how long that is shortly. The next couple of slides I reckon are pretty cool, because they actually make it like they give you the bigger picture sense of what the sequence of events are, and I think that's rather than getting too stuck in the minutiae, given what I was talking about with the elections and changes, I think it's probably better to kind of float at this level at this point in time. So we do have an opportunity, and I think we'll be certainly proposing to council that you take it up, to provide feedback on the National Planning Framework, which has actually just been put out as draft regulations in the last week or two. And we've got a bit of time, which is a nice change of pace from central government. They've actually given us a bit of time to get our head into that and work with council on a submission. And so I'm 100% sure that that's what we'll be doing. Even though there is that risk with even the National Planning Framework that the new government might come in and go, yeah, we don't like that because the last government touched it, which is often what happens, isn't it? So that's an important document because for a long time under the RMA, central government was criticised for not putting out a lot of national direction. There weren't many national policy statements. There weren't many national environmental standards. And governments of many colours over many years were criticised for not issuing many of those, leaving local government to kind of fend for itself in an ambiguous world of the RMA where there were high-level directives about what we should do, but we were left to battle it out, essentially about what the heck it was that actually meant in any given circumstance. Over the last few years, that's changed. All of a sudden, we've got national policy statements and national environmental standards up the wazoo. And so the criticism has actually shifted to become, but guys, we're seeing some conflicts between all of these. How are we supposed to resolve that strong direction that the National Policy Statement for Urban Development says over there, while to enable more housing, while over there you've got a National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management saying, but you need to be very protective of water quality. So the National Planning Framework, I think, in principle, was trying to deal with all of that by bringing all of those existing national policy statements, environmental standards together into one cohesive package, which is a good idea. I don't think anybody would really argue with that in principle. It's just how effective have they been in trying to do that with this first draft. We'll be getting our heads into that over the coming couple of months. So that's the first step, and it was something that I think a lot of submitters actually suggested as the reforms were being formed. That should be a first step. That should be done before the regional spatial strategy is put together, so that when the regional planning framework, regional planning committees, and I'll talk a bit more about those too soon, when they are forming regional spatial strategies, they've got this cohesive national package in place that is a much easier thing to kind of give effect to than billions of different individual national policy statements, etc. So it flows down, and you get the regional spatial strategy as the next step in time. And as you can see there, that's the spatial plan for a wider area, a region, and it factors in all of those key things that need to be factored in when you're thinking about spatial planning over that big area: transport, infrastructure, environmental protection, etc. Once a regional spatial strategy is put into place, that becomes the platform for what's called an NBE plan, and apologies for the acronyms. I'm afraid we're all going to have to get used to a new world of acronyms. NBE plan, natural and built environment, is NBE, legislated by the NBEA, which is the Natural and Built Environment Act. And that will replace individual regional plans, district plans, and the regional policy statement. So we're going to end up under this regime with, I think, is it 14 NBE plans across the country instead of the Gasquillion that we have now. It's a large number. And I don't think anybody, yes, there are obviously issues of concern about loss of local decision making, absolutely. But in terms of a more understandable framework for people to seek permissions under, to do developments, having a single plan which brings everything together instead of having to deal with multiple plans is good common sense. So it hasn't attracted a lot of criticism.
Sorry, I just want to make one point, and that is, Jason's going to talk about the timeframe for this in a second. We haven't landed how those plans will be developed. You're aware that we have things like the Wellington Regional Growth Framework, where we've been working on the future development strategy. The point of me raising this is that it's been a process of districts within the region coming together to develop something. So we still have to work through, and that is some of the detail about how will this actually work in practice. There isn't a predefined schedule of, ta-da, this is what will happen. So there will be further conversation on these kinds of points as Jason's raised already about the uncertainty of where this heads, if it's still happening next year.
That's right, and that is a fantastic segue to the next slide. And you'll see in there, NPF, National Planning Framework, talked a bit about that, going to be doing a submission on that, working with Council. The next acronym is Regional Planning Committee, RPC, and that is the new world order for how planning will occur under the new system. But that new world order will not kick in practice for a little while. It talks about, again, I've mentioned by tranche up there, the fact that central government has to group councils into different tranches, which will then go through the process of establishing regional planning committees on different timeframes. So those in the earliest tranche will be looking to establish their regional planning committee by 2025. Now, we don't know, as I've mentioned at the start, which tranche we're going to be in. That's the soonest that a regional planning committee will be formed. Others will come later, and that will influence the timing of all the other steps, as you can see up here. There is a separate slide that goes into a bit more detail on the regional planning committee, so I won't go into that more just this minute. But that sequence is apparent. Regional spatial strategies, and then the NBE plan. And you can see the timeframes up there. There's like a period of time after each step is completed when the next step needs to be completed. And it really does stretch out into the early 2030s. So there's some notes at the bottom of this slide that are key. And the last point is that district planning will continue. The district planning will continue for quite some time because there just needs to be so much work done in order to set up the new system. So that means there will be district plan changes that will need to keep happening. The government has even put out national direction that still requires us to do district plan changes in outer years. And just one case in point among many is the National Policy Statement on Highly Productive Land. Another one is the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity. These have been released in the last, well, in the case of the Indigenous Biodiversity, months, and are still directing councils to do changes to their district plans under the old system, which will go out into the late 2020s. So district planning is here for what some might still call the long term, depending on how you look at timeframes. But in parallel, there is going to be the evolution of this new system. So we're going to end up doing a couple of different things at once.
Yeah, and I do just want to add on to that point. We've previously talked about the implications of central government reform and the pressure it applies at obviously like regional but district level, which we're very focused on, is essentially whilst we're still progressing district planning changes and we'll be talking to you in the future about what's most important there, what we prioritise. We're also going to have to lift into this new space if it continues, and we'll be having to be engaged in that. And so essentially, it's increasing the resource requirements for this space overall. And as you'd be aware, currently we haven't had any funding from central government to support basically operating what I'm going to say is dual systems, and I think it is the long term. If we look at our long-term plan, it's pushing out over 3 LTPs, we'd be talking at minimum. So I do want to raise that point now, because when we come into the LTP, we will be raising this as a challenge and something we're going to have to address through the coming LTP.
Thank you. So, yeah, a different way of showing the timeline on this slide. You'll see there that there's no requirement from enactment to complete a full district plan review. Now, in the last LTP, and we are going to propose continuing it in the next LTP, there wasn't actually an intention to do a full district plan review anyway. We've done a second generation district plan. We are now on a rolling review program where we are identifying issues and doing targeted plan changes to deal with those issues. So that doesn't really change the world for us. That wasn't going to be our intention anyway. There are councils out there who have yet to do second generation plans or complete their second generation plans. And so for them, they now have a choice about whether they do that or not through a full plan review. The nature of what council might choose to do will change as some of these instruments come into effect, and that's reflected up here on this slide. And so when we do start to see the finalisation of things like the regional spatial strategy and the natural and built environment plan, gradually we will start to see that the need for changing the district plan will change. It will reduce. But as I've said, and as many of these slides have shown, that's just a long, long, long way away. So something to obviously be mindful for, be a participant in shaping, particularly when it comes to the Regional Planning Committee. There's going to be some decisions that council will need to make about how it wants to be involved with that, but over a long period of time. So here's the slide about the Regional Planning Committee, and it's look, it's very different than how district planning is done now. There will be potentially very large regional planning committees. You'll note up here on this slide that there's a lot of words like at least, but not a lot of words of like maximum of. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to be managed. I don't think anybody thinks a regional planning committee of about 40 members is going to be particularly workable. So that'll be a challenge going forward. But a decision for council will need to be how many members will it want to have on this new structure. And there will be a secretariat that supports it that could be made up of some secondments from different councils and some new employees as well. Yeah, we've talked about the NBE plan, and yeah, the fact is that it's just not something which is coming in the near term, and that plan changes to district plan will still be a fact of life for quite some time. So uncertainties, that's really one of the key messages to take home from today is, sure, we've now got new acts, but don't hold your breath that they're going to stay looking exactly like that. And maybe now's not the time to get familiar with all 800 and something pages of them. maybe just wait and see what the election throws up, and then start going from there. The intention at one point was to have 3 acts, and that's still, I think, the current government's intention is to have a 3rd act, a Climate Change Adaptation Act, and it was always going to be a little bit slower than the other 2, but at this stage it's, I think, not really much further than a discussion document, and I don't expect that we're going to see an exposure draft, but who knows, before the election. And that may well be, next steps. Yes, so we do need to kind of play the cards that have been dealt on the table at the moment, and one of those cards is the draft National Planning Framework, which staff will be reviewing, and we will come back to you with advice on how we think that's shaping up over the next couple of months. Thank you.
I might just add to that to say that over the next couple of months, we're proposing that we will be doing some targeted briefings, but also intentionally using this committee as we are developing that advice and taking it forward.
Thank you, that'd be great. Yeah, awesome.
So I'm just checking, are you finished?
Thank you.
Are you open to questions? So does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I've just got a quick question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Councillor
thank you so
Campbell.
much. That was really, really interesting and also very well, kind of well articulated and clearly displayed on the slides. So just a question of clarity, the FDS, will that become the regional spatial plan? Or how do those 2 things interface?
Yeah, so the FDS is going to be basically the precursor to our regional spatial strategy. I think the time frame for when we would need to have an RSS means that it will be time for review of the FDS, and we'll go through that new process for that one.
And then where will the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee sit in with the Regional Planning Committee?
I guess that's still TBC, but you might imagine that they might look fairly similar for the Wellington region, which we might pick.
I want to add to that and say I think there will be opportunity for discussion. So I think some of you are aware that there's a review or underway of the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee and how things are going. I think that's to inform a discussion around next steps, and I definitely think that a conversation will be taken to a mayoral forum of whatever group of districts end up being in pockets. So I wouldn't assume that regions will be cut up the way that we see them today. You saw with the affordable waters that there were some changes and cuts that were made. And so I think that that's part of the TBC part of this and discussions to come if that eventuates. And we would be looking at things like terms of reference and other things would naturally be part of setting up those committees, so there was clarity around how I think district and regional fit together. We've heard from both Labour and National, and I guess my point is irrelevant of who's stepping in, that there's an intention to maintain that localism effect. And so I think we can expect to see that there'll be an opportunity to have your say.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So thank you. There's no more questions, but I just want to make a couple of comments. So it would be great. So obviously there's a lot of uncertainty in this space, and depending on what happens, it might be useful to have the same conversation in a few months' time if there is a change in government. But saying that, obviously there are some changes happening, and it's important that we have got really good oversight for those and can participate where necessary. So if this national planning framework does go ahead, it would be good, to have oversight of the submission and briefings going forward. Yeah, yes, probably here and then maybe going up there, or somehow, as long as we've got some oversight of it. Yeah. So I suppose with that, I'd like to thank Jason, Angela, Chris and Esther for all the work that you've put into getting us to this point. And we'll just leave it for now. Thank you. But I'm not going to let Jason off the hook just now, because as you're here, I thought it'd be useful to move up the plan change conversation we're going to have. So thank you very much. Thank you. So now, so Jason is going to talk about the implication of the implementation of Plan Change 2. Thank you. As an update.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So yeah, Plan Change 2. This is quite possibly going to be the last time that you see a conversation about Plan Change 2 being led by the district planning team. And really, this one's co-led, because Plan Change 2, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Plan Change 2 has been like a very significant plan change, which council made decisions on the 10th of August this year, and which responded to central government's directives to be more enabling of housing intensity, particularly around existing centres, also around rapid transit stops, which in Kapiti are all the railway stations except for the Otaki station, and also across all of our general residential zones. And it was also a plan change that did a number of other significant things, including being more enabling of papakainga housing, which was a very exciting initiative that we worked on very closely with our iwi partners about, and a few other things besides. So we've got the decision, and from council it's made its decision, and Plan Change 2 is now fully operative. So what that means is all of the rules have full effect, the policies and the objectives that support interpretation of those rules, the design guides that are now applicable to developments that require resource consent now have full legal effect. The updated references to the land development minimum requirements, which replaced the previous kind of engineering standards, now have full legal effect, the whole kit and caboodle. And so we now have Plan Change 2 incorporated into the district plan. You don't actually see in our documentation, in our operative district plan anymore, separate references to Plan Change 2. It's sort of now into the plan. And we've done some things since the decision to implement it, and we're working very closely with our partners, and I'm welcome to Laura Willoughby, who's come here from the regulatory part of the business, along with James, which is great.
Thank you, Laura, for being here today.
Oh yeah, all good. Yep, that's good. Next one. Awesome, thank you. So, external implementation actions. So the public notice, as per the direction from the Minister for the Environment, the Minister, you might recall, had required us, along with a bunch of other councils, to put a public notice out by the 20th of August this year about what decision council made on its intensification planning instrument. And we met that timeframe, which was great. Just incidentally, for those of you who weren't aware, the list of councils was, I don't know, roughly about 10 councils, I think. Only us and Selwyn District Council were able to meet that deadline. The other councils needed to seek a extension. And look, that's not a criticism of the other councils, because many of them had different circumstances to us. They were in the midst of a full plan review, for example, and this became a very difficult thing to try to achieve on that deadline. So no criticism implied, but nonetheless, it was a good achievement of council to be able to make that deadline. Submitters, as per the legal requirements, have been directly notified of council's decision. the Minister for the Environment has been informed. He was the Ministry for the Environment was informed immediately upon the Council's decision, and the Minister for the Environment has, as of the 15th of September, received the formal letter referring the rejected recommendation, that one rejected recommendation. Chris.
Just want to note, at the PC2 committee meeting where council made a decision, there was a discussion around adding some context to the letter that provided the recommendation. I just want to note that we undertook that work. So Councillor Halliday and the chair of this committee provided input to that letter, as was agreed. Also, we had circulated the final letter to our iwi partners, and then it was sent to the Minister. So we will be circulating the letter to everyone so you have it for completeness. There are no surprises in it, and we made it clear that we are obviously sending through the recommendation as was required through that process. So just for completeness, I just want to make sure we've covered that off.
Absolutely. So we've also updated our website. Obviously, the website for council is a very important portal for people to understand what's going on with the district plan. So we've updated the text on the website. There was quite a comprehensive body of supporting information on there to help people engage with Plan Change 2 in the first place. So we've updated that. People can now access the panel's report itself, and we have updated our e-plan. And e-plan is a really cool tool, and I really encourage everybody to have a go at using it. And I'm sure if there was an interest in it, we could run a bit of a session to help elected members use it, because it's freaking good. It just makes it so much easier than going through PDFs of chapters and you're just starting to nod off as you do. You can actually do property searches, and it will tell you exactly what zones, what precincts apply to your property, just like that. It's a really good tool. You can also understand things like which qualifying matters apply, etc., etc. So, yeah, highly recommend using ePlan. But we have updated the old school PDFs as well. We have, as you might imagine, when you email all submitters and further submitters, about 300 people, you put a public notice out there. We've got a lot of inquiries. There was a fair bit of media interest as well. So we've been dealing with inquiries and working with our resource consent colleagues to make sure that we get good detailed answers out to people about what the plan change means for them, their development interests, and their property. And we had a really good discussion with developers. Was it last week? Last week. Thanks, James. How many? We ended up with sort of 20 odd, 24 developers, and it was a really good conversation. We traversed, as you might imagine, fairly detailed questions about individual sort of provisions and what they meant, as well as talking about the future. And you might recall that council, in its decision on Plan Change 2, it also set in train some more advice that you'll be receiving over the next few months on other plan changes that might be in train and other actions that would be really useful to support the achievement of well-functioning urban environments across the district, actually. And so, yeah, good chance to talk with developers about the future as well. So that was great. I've mentioned that we have been working really closely with our resource consents team, and that actually extends as a way of working all the way back to when we're scoping plan changes, actually. Our resource consents team has always got the intel on what they are finding is working well and what's not working well. So we really do treasure their advice on that. But when we get to this end of a plan change process, We also have a responsibility as the district planning team to make sure that we help our resource consents team to understand the background for how provisions have changed, and just make sure that we're there to support them, because they are now moving into the position and now hold the position where queries are going straight to them as opposed to us. So that's really important that we work together seamlessly. And we also have been working with our infrastructure team because they are an important part of implementing the district plan too. Just the same as the resource consent team. So we do need to be moving as a collective whole when it comes to the district plan at all times.
Jason, if I can just comment and reinforce how that seems like a no-brainer, but my experience has been that doesn't happen particularly well in a lot of the organisations I've worked in, and where you start to really get a disconnect is at that juncture and that handover and that handshaking, if you like, across, and the downstream effect is actually the policies, if it doesn't work, are rarely implemented as they were intended to, and you have a whole lot of downstream effects. So my compliments to you and to Laura and the team, because I think we've got that bit right, notwithstanding there'll be pain points, but it's important to emphasise that. Thank you.
Thanks, James. So I talked a bit about E-Plan, and I'm not going to rabbit on about it any longer, but only just to say, reinforcing, get into it. And if you've got any questions about it, don't hesitate to shout out to either the resource consents team or myself. We'd be very happy to show you how it works individually or collectively. You might well find that sometimes you get some queries that you could quickly help people to use E-Plan themselves with at times. That's how user-friendly it is once you get your head into it, like anything. So we thought it might be useful just to provide some really simple scenarios, development scenarios, now that Plan Change 2 is in place. And I'm glad that we've got our implementation colleagues here from Resource Consents, because these are the scenarios that they'll be working through on a daily basis. Without any further ado, let's go to the first one. So in this scenario, there actually isn't a resource consent required, and you'll recall the medium density residential standards being a big topic of Plan Change 2, and really it's the incorporation of those into the district plan that in this circumstance has meant there is no longer a resource consent required. So it's not carte blanche. There are permitted activity standards that need to be met in this situation of constructing 2 new residential units on the same site in the general residential zone. There are permitted activity standards that make sure that that's done in an appropriate way. Things like setbacks from the front and the sides are just one of very many examples of the standards that need to be met. But if they are met, in this circumstance, there isn't a need for a resource consent. There is still a need, though, for a building consent. So it's not as though there is no contact with council required in this circumstance. And that sets in train the ability for the gathering of development contributions, financial contributions. There are still conversations with infrastructure required in terms of wastewater and water supply. And there is a monitoring role for council in this circumstance as well.
I'm just going to say before I hand over to Laura that I think an important part that you've just noted there is under building consent, there are other legislative requirements and guidance or settings that are set by central government that at a district level we have to follow. So some of this is not choice by council to decide to do or not do things. It's the requirements that we need to meet. So I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that because we're talking about PC2. Sorry, Laura.
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to add to that because of the change in PC2, we're having to change how we operate a wee bit. Previously, if there were 3 dwellings on a site, we'd normally have required a resource consent. We'd have tight conditions around construction effects, managing those. Because it no longer applies, we are focusing more on the building consents when they come through. Each building consent is being checked for compliance with the district plan and with the Plan Change 2 provisions. And we're also relying on our building inspectors when they're out on site to start reporting, these messy construction sites with tradie vans parked on the berm, that sort of thing. And in doing that, we now have the ability to do permitted activity monitoring and charge for it. So we're looking at how that will come into our fees and charges and how we can make that work and how we can beef up that area. Bit of a change in operations, but we've still got our RMA compliance team who are out there checking these things just in a slightly different way.
In this second scenario here, it talks about subdivision. Subdivision requires a resource consent, but there are some constraints on notification, and those came through the national direction as well. They were another component of that. And so subdivision is a little easier to achieve. It's enabled more now as a result of Plan Change 2 in these residential zone areas than it was before. However, it's still the case that there are standards that need to be met, and those cover a wide range of matters. Things like compliance with the land development minimum requirements is just one example of that. So when I say it's enabling, it is more enabling, but there are still quality control checks in place in the district plan. And much like before, there are still requirements under other legislation as well. And contact is needed with council, but in this case, there is actually a need for resource consent for a subdivision as well.
I think there's one more page left, so I'll just finish the presentation if that's okay. Thanks.
Did you, Laura?
Yeah, if I could just add to that, if we can go back to the previous slide. So this, again, is a different way of operating for us. So previously, if there were 2 or 3 units built on a site, we'd be checking for them to have separate services, making sure that all the connections could stand alone. I suppose if we don't need to check these three-storey, 3 buildings developments when they come through at resource consents, they just need to demonstrate at building consent stage that they can be serviced, and they may well put in shared connections. The problem with that is when you come back later and decide to subdivide these units off, we're still going to be requiring them to have individual connections, which means potentially digging up driveways and relaying pipes. We're trying really to signal early on to people, even if you just want to build those 3 units now and your plan in the future is to subdivide 1 or 2 off, put in the separate connections now, because we will be needing them to be separate in order to do a fee simple subdivision. So that's gone through in the new land development minimum requirements document. We're signalling that. The other issue we're dealing with, what people want more water connections. Previously we had 1 connection per lot. Now you can have 3 houses on a lot. Do we want them to have separate connections or not? So we're grappling with all this stuff as it comes through. But just, again, a change in how we operate and just signalling and sending those messages earlier.
And just to pick up on that point, Laura's right. We really have been grappling with this, trying to look down in the future where people might build 3 by 3 and then want to subdivide them all off at some later point. Interestingly, for the infrastructure guys, this has been a real challenge because their water services bylaw or whatever doesn't align with this. So you've got all of this misalignment, and Sean and I have had to make some courageous decisions and go, this is or give direction. So, but it has been this in particular has been a real work in progress.
And the final one of these really simplified examples or scenarios is a new 6-storey apartment developments containing 15 residential units in the high density residential zone. And those of you who maybe didn't follow PC2 like incredibly closely, the high density residential zone was something that came out in the final form of Plan Change 2, and it is where there is the most, essentially the most density enabled under the district plan around particular centres, particularly the metropolitan centre. And so in this situation, there is a land use consent required, and that's because while the 6 stories itself is enabled in that high density residential zone, the fact is it actually includes more than 3 residential units. That's the thing that triggers the resource consent requirement here. There are constraints on notification, but limited notification may be required in certain circumstances where certain permitted activity standards are breached. And so there is the potential in this circumstance often for the design guides to feature and be a factor in decision making. But certainly it's the case that Plan Change 2, quite deliberately, was being, in fact it had to be, under the national direction, enabling in this circumstance. This was one of the challenging things that you'll recall in the developments of this plan change, but it was something that national direction required. Is there any comments you might have on this circumstance, Laura?
Yeah, sure. So this will be new for our planners in terms of seeing buildings of this scale. The design guides that have been put forward under the plan change are really useful. It directs our planners to check and make sure that there's, good setbacks, that the rooftops are not consistent and that sort of thing. But also getting us to think about things like wind effects and loss of daylight at a slightly different scale, which is going to take a bit of time for them to get their head rounds, I think. But we do have the tools there to guide us on it. I think that's the main thing. Oh, and also just ensuring that commercial element on the ground floor comes through when it's required to. Please you mentioned the notification clauses, because I think I counted 32 rules in Plan Change 2 that have a non-notification clause. So some of them preclude full notification, which, and others preclude full notification and limited. So that's what our planners are going to have to work with. So I think and as you said, it's enabling legislation for intensification. So yes, we can expect less notification potentially of some of the developments than we previously would. So our planners have to get our heads around that and start thinking about what the effects, what the new permitted baseline envelope looks like, and what, if you breach that, where does the effect lie and how much of an effect is it. So yeah, it's a bit of change for us all, but like I said, we've got the tools to guide us on it, so hopefully it'll be fine.
And that was the end of the presentation, so happy to take questions, work with Laura to address those. Cheers.
Thank you, Jason, Laura and Chris. So we have one question to start off with from Councillor Coe.
2 questions, actually.
Okay, sorry, 2.
The first one is, I'm sort of thinking, what's the impact on the whole tiny home industry? Because my understanding was that arose, to get around the issue of resource consents and that kind of thing. Is that correct? Like building below a certain size, was it 40 square metres or something like that, enable people to, put these things on without having to go through that process. So that's my first question: is does this sort of, get rid of that issue, and so tiny homes are no longer a way to get around legislation? Secondly, I'm interested to know how we can best inform homeowners of what the new situation is, because I'm aware there are a number of people who are looking to extract more value out of the properties that they own, particularly as they enter into retirement and they're looking for alternative sources of income. So how do we increase awareness of that? Because I think we should encourage that because it's solving our housing problem and also enabling them to supplement their NZ super income in a relatively cost-effective way. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
I think whilst we have the district planning team here and the resource consent team, I would like to note that I think this might be part of our growth story actually, and the conversation we're having with the community. So, as part of Vision Capity, and asking people what they're wanting and how we're working with them, I think there might be other parts of the organisation that get involved to help with that conversation. It might be that I bring Darren Grant and some of the other people in the team who are focused on housing and working with developers in the community on some of those things to come back and maybe pick up on that point rather than try and cover it off today. I'm thinking in terms of your last point about people having those opportunities and how we work with them. And I know
I'm
that
sure a lot of people, PC2 is just, what's PC2,
and from that perspective as well, before we get into district plan and its enablement of tiny homes, which I know Jace is going to have something to say, I would say that I think some of what we will be coming to talk to you about around tiny homes and their potential to support a wide range of benefits for the community. I think there's more to be seen in the tiny home space. Just as a note, Horowhenua district has actually started on a tiny homes, I'll call it a village, already because of the benefits of it. So
there's different drivers.
Yeah, there's different drivers.
Around the
absolutely. So that isn't a technical response. I think it's one about that housing space and the ongoing conversation we're going to have with you in that space about opportunity. But I will hand over to Jason and then Laura.
I take a pretty dry policy approach to that question of tiny homes. For me, I want to understand what people mean by tiny homes, because I know a lot of people bring to the table the idea of we think tiny homes the answer, but they actually are talking about quite different things at times. Sometimes they might be talking about am I able to legally put, frankly, a vehicle or collection of vehicles on a property, and I'll call that a tiny home because that might be a way of achieving my ends. Others talk about clustered developments where there are actually proper dwellings, but they are almost in a papakainga kind of style of housing. So for me, it's probably the first step for us is to make sure that we understand what we mean by the concept, and then understand what the district plan post PC2 actually is saying in response to the various flavours of what a tiny home concept might be. And that story is different and depending on what zone you're in too. So if you want to do, say, some kind of a tiny home initiative in a general residential zone, Plan Change 2 has probably made your options a little bit easier, because you can now do 3 units on a site without needing a resource consent, whereas previously you would have needed a resource consent. Plan Change 2 doesn't change the world in the rural zone. So if you wanted to do a clustered development on a piece of general rural zone land, the rules haven't changed as a result of PC2, and they are probably going to be reasonably unfriendly to a large number of units, residential units on a rural zone land, and there are reasons for that. So I guess the policy process would need to start with an understanding of what the status quo looks like, and then we will need to figure out, while there might well be benefits, I'm sure, in enabling tiny home options more, we also need to look at what the costs might be. And so just taking the rural zone situation as an example, you'd want to think twice about being enabling of that where there's highly productive land, just for example. So there's not usually a free lunch when it comes to district plan changes. There's always going to be some things to weigh up, but it would be consistent with the growth strategy to have a look at that, because the growth strategy is a lot about different housing typologies and being enabling of those. So open mind, just conscious of the strain of work that will need to be done.
If you wanted to have a tiny home community, you're not going to fit that on a standard residential section, you know. So it kind of implies it needs to be in a rural area. So yeah, and I guess, yeah, do we want to encourage that kind of thing?
Just to add to that as well, I suppose when I think about the compliance issues we have around tiny homes, a lot of them are in the rural area because you need land. And I'd just like to add as well, from a regulatory perspective, as soon as there's any plumbing goes into any of the services, then a building consent is still required.
And actually, just over the top of that, we've got a live one of those at the moment. And I think I take you back to the conversation we had earlier on about climate resilience and the environment strategy. It's about prioritising the use of those highly productive soils. So we've got a live enforcement issue up the line a little bit on that. Yeah, yep. And I do, you know, if you've got minutes of an evening, go and have a look at Auckland's journey on the metropolitan urban limit that they've wrestled with for about 40 years, and they pushed that out after the merger of the councils, adopted the unitary plan. A lot of the highly productive soils and the Pukekohe area have gone, and they'll never come back, and that was the food basket for Auckland. So that's the prioritisation you have to do in your policy settings. So quite a challenge for you guys and for us.
I think I just want to leave a last comment, which is around our rules and our policy settings. We will be coming back to the table to talk about the priorities for the district plan and areas of interest, actually. I do think tiny homes will be in that conversation or in the mix of it, as well as a number of other things. During PC2, we had talked about considerations like local areas and some other zonings that we said we might come back and talk about. So there'll be a range of things we come back and continue to have a conversation with. PC2 going live is a wonderful step, and obviously that was a big piece of work which you made I think, courageous decision on to move forward. Is not the end. So I just want to note that. So for us, we're closing the door on this and handing over to our very capable colleagues in the resource consents area and infrastructure, and we'll still be coming back to talk about a few other things with you.
So thank you now. So we move on to Glenn Olsen.
Yeah, thank you. Now, understanding, we're in very early days on this, but I'm just wondering, do we have any indication of expected uptake, especially talking about the height side of this? Have we already received any requests for developers who are already wanting to do this, or have we been notified or aware, from discussions you've had of things that we can expect, coming in quite soon, or, in the next year or so?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there's been a lot of interest sort of at pre-application stage. Has it come through in consents yet? Not really. These things do take a while to put together. We are also getting some pushback against the use of sites. So by that I mean we're getting a lot of people saying that because we're now intensifying and more units can go on sites, there's no space or room to put in, say, water tanks, which is another requirement of the plan. So we're getting a lot of queries around that saying, well, hang on, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to intensify, but we can't because there's no space? So what we're doing is actually finding different ways of working again with water tanks, so looking at slimline options, that sort of thing. So yeah, a lot of people are interested, and they're starting to test the waters a bit around the other policy stuff in the district plan, just to see what will give or how it'll all add up. But in terms of big developments that are coming through, just pre-application talks at this stage.
And are they all over the district or focused in specific areas, parts of it? Does there seem to be like, parts which are more hotter than others, I guess?
No, look, we're not seeing any pattern at this stage. What I did want to just layer over the top of what Laura said, you as elected members will get community pushback on this. So be aware that we will have 2 or 3 years of growing pains as the community gets comfortable with what medium density looks like. So we see that people get wind that there's been a developer sniffing around the site. They'll be writing to us, say, we object and we want our objection heard. That's not quite how the process works, but there is that tension for the regulator. That will spill over into your environment.
I think I might also note that outside again of district planning and resource consenting, we are working with developers in the community more broadly to get an indication of interest and, I'll say, early intention even before pre-app around a resource consent. And we do come into the table and talk to you about it. So we are working with and alongside developers. I think another step that's to come through from PC2 is to talk about in the next 6 months a number of steps, but one of those things is the idea of an urban panel. So starting to think about the design of some of the spaces that we have and how we're doing that together with, I'm going to say, key contributions from the community. So there aren't just 1 or 2 things we do. It's a wider scheme of how it comes together. So I just do want to say that we do come through and talk to you about that, particularly when we have an indication that there are larger developments or interest in larger developments coming through. So that will continue, and we'll be looking to bring those developers to meet with council at different committees so that we can make sure that we're part of a conversation in the community, rather than it just being what feels like random developments happening. That doesn't stop what we might call the mum and dad developments, which might be somebody putting a couple of extra buildings or options on the table. So a mixed bag of the things potentially.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
So, so I just want to point out it's 10 to 1. We actually have another briefing at 1:30. There's 2 more people who want to speak here. So we're happy to keep going as long as we have a very short lunch. Are people happy with that? Yep. Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we'll go to Simon Black online. So Robbie, you will get your, and Dave, you will get your opportunity. Thank you. So Robbie,
Thanks,
sorry. Yeah, Simon online.
Thanks, team. That's okay. I think I've been. My question was actually handled by James when I was going to ask, how do all of our other policies get balanced with the PC2 side of things? Let's say with our environmental strategy, hydro neutrality, and how do we look after the land and our environment as opposed to just intensifying it?
I could just briefly add that there is still a lot of checks and balances. I know we talk about PC2 being enabling, and it is, but there are still provisions in the plan, things like hydraulic neutrality live on as a requirement. There are still protections, qualifying matters in terms of protecting key Indigenous trees, ecological sites, sites of significance to mana whenua. There are infrastructure rules that continue to apply. All of the natural hazard protections in the district plan continue to apply. So as much as we emphasise how enabling Plan Change 2 has made the district plan, and it has, one just needs to avoid, I guess, confusing that with it being a carte blanche approach to development, because that's not what we have in the district. We're quite fortunate that we've actually got operative provisions in place for things like managing flood hazards, etc., and having ecological sites or significant natural areas mapped in the plan. I'm forever grateful that our forebears have actually made the hard calls to get those in the district plan, because not every district has that luxury of having those things in their plan right now. So I think we're well positioned, but there's always room for improvement, and Chris has talked about the Forward Work Programme as an opportunity to identify some of those areas for improvement.
Excellent. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Simon. So we'll now move on to Councillor Hanford.
My question was quite similar to Community Board Member Glenn Nelson's, just around kind of how quickly we see, obviously it's now enabled, but how quickly we see it kind of coming on stream in terms of the housing being able to be provided, like how long that process will take, recognising that, as you mentioned, Laura, it's a lot for the team to kind of get their head around. So will it cause a bit of a lag, I guess, is the question. How quickly will it come on stream?
I think just the one thing I was going to add when we were answering Community Board Member Olsen's question was the housing and business capacity assessment, because that kind of becomes the official word every 3 years about what we expect to happen under the regulatory settings that we have at the time that we did that assessment. And the next version is going to be due out, I think, later this year.
December.
Thank you. And it will be reflective of the notified version of Plan Change 2, which is different than the final version, but also, you know, the world under the notified version looked a lot more like the decisions version of Plan Change 2 than the world before it. And you'll see, I expect, some commentary in there about what the housing numbers will look like under that scenario. And there will be commentary in that on things like the feasibility of medium density and high density developments. And you can expect to see that there will be a shift there, and there will be, one would expect, more capacity enabled. And given that we have a housing crisis, that's a good news story.
So just to put another layer on that, and it depends whether you see it as a silver lining or not, construction cost and just the market forces that are driving development or not at the moment, I think things will remain reasonably slow until we get greater certainty post-election. And of course, interest rates will drive that. So I think the whole cost of construction, you're seeing a lot of smaller businesses go to the wall. So that might be creating the lag as well, which might be a silver lining or not.
So thank you, everyone, for your questions. I have a couple as well. So I suppose starting off with the e-plan, it is a really, really great tool. It's a really great tool. But to me, though, it's about getting that information out to people to be able to know that it's there. And I'm just probably picking up on a comment that Liz made in terms of getting the information out there so that they can actually do whatever they want to do. The other side of it is that there are one or two areas, and I'm talking about Peka here, where there's probably was an expectation of they could, make changes to their properties where 3 houses, 3 stories high, whereas that hasn't happened. So in some areas, in that area, and so I'm just wondering whether or not those people are being informed as well, where by exception, are they being informed as well?
So the Peka situation relates to, there's a qualifying matter that applies to that area, which is the coastal qualifying matter. And just as a little explanation, in the Peka area, the existing flood hazard mapping did not extend to that area. We have great flood hazard mapping in the district plan that covers most urban environments, but it didn't cover that. And so part of the Plan Change 2, the process of its development, there was a submission that led to the coastal qualifying matter precinct in Peka ending up looking a little bit different than the precinct elsewhere along the coastline in urban areas. So typically the coastal qualifying matter precinct looks like a straight line. And in Peka, it doesn't look like that. It looks a little bit different. And it looks a bit different because it actually incorporates some of the like the bathtub approach to inundation modelling. In order to, it was the best proxy for flood hazard that we had at the time. The choice was either that things like the government's medium density residential standards could roll into that area unmanaged and risk the consequence of greater intensification occurring in places where perhaps it shouldn't. Or we reached to the available information, which was inundation modelling, which had been produced for the Takatai Kapiti process through the Jacobs work. And it was determined by the hearings panel that it was better to have something than nothing in order to be able to manage that flood hazard issue in Peka Peka. And so that's what transpired to make that look the way it looked.
Can I just add to that to say, as part of the forward work program, we are going to be looking at an update to our flood and I would say flood hazards for the district plan. And we are and have modelling underway, which is using a broader approach to look at ground flooding as well as the impact of climate change and a bunch of other things. And we will be coming through to talk to you about that work in due course and the opportunity and timing of that update. So the reason I'm saying that is the qualifying matter that is in PC2, once we update that work and we have those new measures in place, that will replace that. So I think what Jason's saying at the moment is consider it a holding or a placeholder for those qualifying matters, which over time will be updated.
Thank you for that. So I suppose my question was more about informing those people of this exception rather than what would have been expected. But your comments did raise another question, because I thought that the information used by the panel to make a decision was on the flood maps that we have, but from what you're saying is that there might have been some other information that was used to actually decide in this particular area.
Oh, so yeah, it's pretty straightforward. The advice that was given to the panel was that where we have flood hazard mapping, it's pretty solid. Yes, there is a process underway to update that modelling, but we actually, compared to other districts, have a pretty good district plan that has flood hazards mapped in it, different kinds of hazards and different kind of rules for each kind of hazard based on degree of risk. However, in Peka Peka, there just happened to be a gap in the modelling. The flood hazard mapping in the district plan does not extend to the Peka Peka general residential zone. That little wee rectangle that just happened to be general residential zone hadn't been covered by the flood hazard mapping in the district plan, and hence the tough choice, I guess, that the panel had. Do they leave properties which were based on the best available information, which was the inundation modelling, looking like they might have some level of risk? Do they just leave that, or do they put something in? And Chris is right, the coastal qualifying matter precinct is an interim measure. Do they put something in to manage that risk? And that was what they ended up recommending to council to do. So it's a very unique to Peka Peka issue.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. So I have one other question, which it's sort of been touched on a little bit here, and that's in relation to having one site with multiple buildings on it, but ideally it's best to have separate services. So my question relates to, and we've talked about water and sewerage. I'm quite interested, as a lot of people know, about the stormwater side of things. And, you know, I hear quite a lot of stuff where, you know, you've got to have this tank in, but we don't have space, and so they get an exemption for it. And to me, you know, if that is the case, then potentially that there is going to exacerbate this issue, plus, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the amount of coverage of a site has actually now, hard coverage of a site has actually gone up. So how can our district plan, is there a need, or is it able to have a conversation in our district plan about looking at some of these details that might need a little bit more work? So there's probably two questions in there. One is about the specific stormwater side of things, but also to being able to look at our district plan, because what changes were made in it were based on submissions rather than councillors having any input to that.
I think there's an acceptance that the tank-related provisions are probably a little bit blunt and need a bit of nuance, and that does need to be looked at in the district plan and a plan change in the future. I think that's what the practice has probably been suggesting, that within what we're allowed to do under the Resource Management Act, which is a little bit constrained, as you've learnt through the Plan Change 2 process, we need to just always mention that those constraints are going to live on post Plan Change 2. But yes, we still have the ability to look at those provisions, I'm sure, and introduce some nuance to them over time.
Yeah, just to add to that from my perspective, so hydraulic neutrality is always checked at building consent stage, so that won't change. We'll still be looking for that to occur because it's a requirement of the district plan, so it has to be met. In terms of the water tanks, my comment was more about people need to start thinking about coming up with different designs, I think, is the main thing. The standard round tanks take up a lot of space. We're starting to throw out some examples of slimline tanks that can fit under eaves, and you can have a wall of them sitting under your eaves. You can have them under driveways, you can have them under houses, you can put them under decks. It's just thinking a bit different from that standard round tank, which is what everyone's used to dealing with, and there was room with single dwellings to do that. So it's just a shift in how to achieve it. And there's certainly a requirement under the Building Act to, and we're looking for outdoor taps and making sure that the tanks are there to service and clean the buildings. So it is all caught up in the Building Act as well, so it's still stuff that is being looked at.
And they look at it in real detail, and I just want to reassure the committee we don't issue dispensations. Otherwise we're creating a problem downstream, literally, in 10 or 15 years. So I just want to make sure we're clear on that. We are looking, as Laura says, alternate solutions. The building team are really good at holding that line. Now they are that last line of defence now with some of the medium density changes.
Okay, so thank you for everyone for coming along. Very, very detailed conversations, really good questions, and appreciate all the effort you've put in through this plan change, and now it's over to your team, James. Yes, thank you. So I just want to have a quick chat. Thank you. So thank you. Obviously, our agenda has taken a look, quite a while to get through today. So we are going to now hear from Robbie and David in relation to the waste management minimisation plan. So thank you. Welcome.
And we're going to test their agility.
No, we're not. No. So just updating now. So the Parks asset management plan is going to be lay on the table until our next meeting. So thank you, Robbie and David. Apologies for the length of time it's taken to get to you. Obviously, we've had, some fairly meaty conversations, but this is also another meaty conversation. We're fully aware of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Chair. First off, I just wanted to introduce David. So David Binstead started as Senior Waste Minimisation Officer about 3 months ago now. Cool. So we'll get through this pretty quickly. So public consultation finished at the end of August on the WMP. This is what it looked like. this platform's still up, so it's lesswastegreaterplace.co.nz. All the documents are still on there if you haven't seen them, so the WMP, the local action plan, and the regional action plans. So the branding of these slides is what we've decided on as the regional waste teams' collaborative efforts. So that's what it'll look like, and we'll try and use this branding moving forward. So submitters could submit on the whole plan, or individual councils, or a combination. So this is what it looked like. So in total, there were 194 submissions. 25 of those were for Kapiti. We just had the oral hearings yesterday, so there were 12 in total, 2 of those from Kapiti. That works out to about 12%, so slightly above our population share of the region, which is quite good. Cool, so this is one of the questions that was asked for the regional consultation. So the vision's at the top there, proposed vision for the draft plan. So about 51% agreed with this. A lot said it wasn't aspirational, so we're just trying to find a balance between those things. It's not necessarily supposed to be aspirational as such. It's not going to be a zero waste to landfill in a few years, but it is really what we do. It is our work program, and it is achievable. So we just really got to find that balance where it's not sort of too flat. In general, 50% support was okay, but yeah, now sort of back to the drawing board to see how we incorporate all this feedback. So 48% of people agreed that the plan sets a clear direction on how the Wellington region will minimise waste. A big chunk of that was neutral as well. In general, the regional objectives were supportive, skewed off to the left there with strongly agree and agree. And for Kapiti specifically, there's a lot of support, a lot of really, out of the 25 submissions, they were really good quality, quite well informed. So this one here, so 91% strongly agreed or agreed that our LAP contains actions that would minimise waste, reduce emissions, and restore and protect the environment. 100% of those submissions agreed or strongly agreed that our actions would support the community and business to minimise waste, reduce emissions, and protect the environment. So one of the other questions for our local action plan submission was related to the Ministry for the Environment's new mandates for curbside collections. So this question here was, do you support the implementation of curbside food scraps by 2030 as it's written in the Act? So 96% of people supported that. The only reason it's not 100 was people telling us to do it quicker, saying that, why wait till 2030? Same with curbside recycling. So the Act states that all households councils have to ensure access to all households, which may look different to the current model. So 100% of people supported these changes to curbside to ensure that every resident has access to a service like that. On the there are a couple really interesting comments on the curbside food scraps. A number of these people that supported it did home composting as well, but I think there was sort of 2 or 3 that said the same thing. I compost at home. It's not really it's not that difficult to get someone set up without a curbside food scrap system, but they still supported this because they realised that not everyone does that. So really cool to see that people that wouldn't necessarily need the service themselves still supported it. So some key local messages that came through a few times, obviously, was that starting at the top of the waste hierarchy, making large producers take responsibility for creating waste. Something that's a little bit outside of the scope of the plan, other than just being a voice and advocate for this sort of thing. With resounding support for the organics collections. I think every person said do it quicker, don't wait. It ties in really well to our climate action framework as well. Organic waste specifically is probably the closest link to our climate actions in terms of waste, obviously biogenic methane emissions from landfills. A few comments about do more for C&D waste and focus on development and construction waste. Construction and demolition waste. So a lot of that's already underway. It's not visible at all yet. It will be soon. I guess tying into the last presentation as well is that there's also the solid waste bylaw also contributes to some provisions for those developments, specifically multi-unit developments. So, when we talk about bringing in that big picture of all the plans and resource consents, waste does have a say in that as well, and it's just bringing that together to make it all normal. It's a regular thing. A number of submitters said waste should be a core council service. That's how it's sort of viewed in the community. And there was also lots of really good feedback saying that Kapiti Council has provided really good community support from the waste teams over a number of years, so a number of teams. So in general, a really, really positive experience with these submissions locally. So our next steps for the plan. So this will be summarised in a bit of a tidier report that we can share. It should be done mid-October now. It's come forward a bit. There's one more joint committee workshop. So it's the regional joint committee. We'll all get together and just see how we can incorporate all these bits of feedback. There's amendments and recommendations that will be finalised from both us as project leads, also the consultant, and then also DEM services. So there's quite a few moving parts that will get added to the report if necessary. Aiming for the final WMP with all of those changes incorporated through the final workshop with the consultation summary. We're aiming for December 4th to the joint committee, and then the final WMP adopted by Kapiti Council on December 14th. So that's our time frames. We're on track at the moment and really, really keen to wrap this one up this year and just get stuck into it. So that's a really quick crash course into how consultation went. I guess any questions if we have time?
Appreciate that very succinct presentation, which gave an awful lot of information. So are there any questions? No, it sounds like you've done a perfect job. Oh, you've got one, Sophie.
Well, yeah, I'll just ask one, might as well. So when the final plan comes to us on the 14th of December, is that likely to also have with it some kind of budgetary considerations? Like in terms of those, like the food waste stuff, for example, like when does that slot into a budget conversation?
Yeah, at this stage it just outlines how it's funded, which for us it's majority waste levy funding, although it does outline that it would be a targeted rate if we did do that. But then, so the actual funding more comes down to an implementation plan. Those previously haven't been done, which is one thing we've really picked up on. I think everyone got a bit fatigued with this process and then just sort of carries on. So we've actually planned this time for the next step to do an implementation plan. On the funding for that, because obviously that's expensive and unplanned OPEX if we were to roll out a curbside service. So we're currently getting all those options assessed by a contractor just to see. It should go into the LTP for public consultation too. So leading up to that, obviously it needs to go through council quite a few times and a lot of really hard discussions, and then we'll figure out the preferred position.
So what's the time frame for the implementation plan development?
That's a good question. Should we early next year, first quarter of next year easily. Yeah.
And that's sorry, one more thing. Is that a regional implementation plan or a local implementation plan?
Both. Yeah, I'm not too sure. I guess we will do one here specific for Kapiti. Then there will also be a regional plan as well for the regional projects and actions. We've actually just proposed a second regional advisor as well. So there's actually a team of regional waste officers to take charge on these regional actions that maybe weren't funded or planned for before. So yeah, it's really exciting. There's a lot. We're building on the last plan, which just sort of saw a few holes in it, and we've made plans to fix that this time.
Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Robbie, and your team. In this review and research, did much come out from the community in terms of Kapiti residents about the way their waste is collected and managed? Because I know in the community there's a lot of confusion and there's duplication of operators going down the same streets, and it's continually come up over years since the way we collect our waste in this district.
Yeah, it did come up a little bit in the consultation. Number of trucks, how much control we have over the private market, whether we're getting a good deal for residents. That sort of stuff has all come up, and it does come up in person quite a lot as well. So while it's not a direct goal of implementing a new curbside system, potentially that would be part of it that is really favoured by our community as well. Is there much of that?
So just before we go to Liz, in relation to the curbside system, so that is it 2027, and that's a government requirement. So it's not a case of if, it's when.
Yeah, I mean anything could happen through the elections.
Yes,
Unfortunately,
yes,
it's
yes.
been drafted and gone to Parliament, the very first cabinet paper, which includes all of this stuff. But it's not like it's in too far that if someone wanted to, they in theory could go back on it. But I feel like the stuff isn't in the firing line. Yeah, so it's not 100% locked in. Most councils are just going to do it anyway, regardless. Yeah, it's an interesting situation. I'm not sure.
The reason I ask this is because this probably was going to say this will need to be a long-term plan conversation,
Yep.
And it's probably a few dollars involved.
Yep.
What else? Well, I suppose it's a case of where, given the decision on the 14th of December, are there going to be any financial implications which potentially will feed into our long-term plan process?
Not at that stage, no.
Except the curbside recycling.
Yeah, so it's in our local action plan, which lets us fund it. It doesn't sign us up to anything. It's there to reflect the waste strategy. Part of the WMMPs had to reflect the new waste strategy. Yeah, so it doesn't sign us up for curbside recycling. And there's also a lot of different ways that could look as well while meeting the requirements. So we don't necessarily have to roll out a whole curbside contract for 4 different waste streams.
No,
there's potentially
otherwise.
Yeah. It could be recycling and organics only. It could be through a bylaw mechanism. So it's not, our only options aren't the most expensive thing. If you were going to do all of that, it would be, some councils have had a 5 to 7% rates increase alone, just from curbside.
Yeah. Okay, I think that'll be a conversation for another day as well. So now we'll go to Liz. Thank you.
Just look really quickly, how do we encourage more people to compost? I mean, it's not that difficult. So can we not issue free compost bins or something and people just chuck their food scraps in? I mean, if as much as anything, it just reduces the volume of stuff that needs to be collected because it just, gets, it just decays away. So
yeah, and the problem is that there's up to 50% of waste at curbside is organic and can be composted. Kapiti Council's done quite an intensive home composting program, which has probably, reached quite a few residents. So we do the $40 vouchers, subsidised home composting systems. I think, while we try and push individual responsibility, the reality is that a lot of people just aren't going to do it. And maybe the answer is to just roll it out to everyone's doorstep.
depends on the purpose, because some people say, well, I don't have a veggie garden, so I'm not going to compost, but that's not necessarily the purpose of it. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
look, I wish every bin had a compost bin or a worm farm in their homes, but I think it's going to be harder to get everyone on board with, unfortunately.
Okay, so thank you. Apologies again for the serious delay in the time that it's taken for you to get to us to present your presentation. This is also another area that that this community and this subcommittee and our councillors are very, very interested in. And so we will look to see what comes back to us on the 14th of December and the precursor slightly before that. So thank you again. So now we'll move on to, as I said earlier on, our destination parks asset management plan is going to lie on the table for our next meeting. So then we now move on to the confirmation of minutes, and if you go to page 36, can I have a mover for these minutes?
I'll move.
A seconder? Any conversations? Any
No.
discussion? All those in favour?
Aye.
Against?
Lunch.
The motion is passed. So, so now the last item on our agenda is a closing karakia. Would anyone like to provide a closing karakia? Because my understanding Kim is not online anymore.
Sounds like you, Sophie.
Yeah, okay, I think I can.
Thank
Cool.
you, Sophie.
No worries. Unuhia ki te uru tapanui, kia wātia, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairoa i te ara takatā. Koi ai rongo whakairia ake ki runga, kia tīna. Haumie huie, tai ki e.
Thank you, everyone else. Big meeting. Lots of good conversations. Thank you. Sorry, in the extra time it took.